Hello and welcome back to another episode of Let's Build an E-commerce Store with a Spring Boot Backend. Episode 14 is unit testing part 4, the fourth iteration of our unit testing section. So this is a multi-parter. If you haven't seen part 1, 2, 3, which is episode 11, 12 and 13 respectively, please go back and watch those first. But anyway, as we are here, let's get straight into it and jump into the development environment. Okay, and back in our development environment for another set of unit testing. So before we start, like I hinted, this is going to be roughly around the region of authentication based stuff. So we're going to need some data to fill out in our tables. If you remember a little while ago, we created this data.sql file that added 2 users to the tables for us whenever the JUnit system runs. You can see now here that I've updated this off camera because I just didn't want to put in too much effort on camera because it's a lot of just kind of copy pasting. But if you remember even further back, we had this insert dummy dev data SQL where we had all these kind of products and inventory and all these bits and pieces of data inserted for us. So what I've done is I've kind of taken that and updated it to be able to be injected into our JUnit in-memory database. So you can see here I've added a third user, for example. We've got 2 addresses, 5 products, some inventory, and we've created some orders for those users, and we've got some quantities against those orders. So this is kind of just copy and pasting here. Obviously, in the description, as always, there is the link to the GitHub. You'll be able to just go on the GitHub and just download this file directly if you want, because it's a lot easier than writing it out. But it's all here. I mean, if you wanted to create your own one, feel free. But obviously, remember that the JUnits are going to be expecting certain data, so you're going to have to manipulate that yourself. So let's get straight into it. So we've added this data.sql, but something since the last episode, which some of you may have noticed if you had run the JUnits in this way, is if you select the top package and run all the JUnits at once, you'll notice that when Spring initializes, it starts here, it does its little bit for the first couple of them, and then you see that we start getting loads of errors again, and that's really strange. Well, why do we get these errors? So if we look at the error, we're getting error creating bean, blah 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 blah. Fail to execute SQL script statement 1 of URL, blah blah blah. Insert into local user. Well, that's our code, isn't it? That's our SQL. We wrote that. If we scroll down all the way, or further down anyway, and it says unique index or primary key violation. And when I first saw this, I was rather stumped, and I looked into it. And if you come and click at the very top one where it shows you the log for everything, you can see here. So we start Spring, and then later on we're starting Spring again. And starting Spring twice means that our data.sql gets run twice as well. Now, what I found out, which I personally am still struggling to quite wrap my head around of why, is that if you have Spring Boot test, it's going to launch Spring with a specific context. But if you then do Spring Boot test and auto configure mock MVC, it uses a different context, and therefore it starts Spring up again. Now, for the life of me, I cannot figure why this is. So there's 2 ways around this. Either you can alter the SQL so that it just knows not to insert duplicate data, which personally doesn't sound quite right to me. The way I found a way around it is if you literally just add auto configure mock MVC to all of your unit tests, and that way all of your unit tests are going to start with the same context. So that's what I'm doing here. And as you can see, if I run this now, all the unit tests again now, they'll all pass again now. So I'm not quite sure around this. If anybody has an idea or has some sort of concept of why this may be, please feel free to comment below with a suggestion or tip, because I can't quite understand it or why. Now, obviously, it would be better that the data.sql could handle multiple runs, or it could be better that really we only run the data.sql once. Now, I'm not too worried about that, because in the future we're going to have an automated system for schema updating, which also allows us to insert data, and that would allow us to make sure it's only run once as well. So in the future, this isn't big of a problem. So I'm kind of going, let's do this temporary workaround for now, where we kind of just chuck this in, and as you can see, it all works. Now, I know in the last episode I said we're going to tackle API stuff with the user authentication, but I did realise that we've missed one other. We've missed one other bit of code to test. And if we go up in our API package, we've got the security package, which has our request filter and our web security config. Now, the web security config we don't need to test, because that's kind of, it gets tested throughout all the code, the JUnits that we're doing. But the request filter itself, this is something we will have to manually test, because when we go to do the authentication based API stuff with mock MVC allows you to inject what user you are. So we won't be using this logic, which means we need to unit test it. So let's come into API, and we're going to go to a new package in our test area, and we got API dot security. Security, and then we're going to create a new class, and that class is going to be called JWT request filter test. And as always, we're going to do that spring boot test ahead of it, and auto configure mock MVC. And then what we want to do is we want to auto wire our JWT service, because we're going to need JWTs to be able to provide the filter with. We're also going to auto wire in the local user DAO, so that we can grab the users from the database to test with. And then what we need to do is, this is where it gets a bit tricky, because what we want to do is verify that the filter is kicking in. So we kind of want to be able to say, oh, look at this path to check if it's working. So let's give it a private static final string, and that's my authenticated path. And as before, we created the auth/me, which is only allows authenticated users in. So let's use that. Okay, so now we've got our little bits of variables at the top. Let's create a test. So what do we want to test first? Well, what happens when we try and access authenticated path when it's spelt correctly? Authenticated path. What happens when we access that without a token at all? Right. So let's do that. Test unauthenticated request. Right, and then we go mvc.perform as we have before. Oh yeah, sorry, that's something else we need to auto wire. That's what I drew the blank at earlier. So we want to auto wire our mock MVC as well. So import that mvc perform, and it's going to be a get on the authenticated path. And we're going to import that. Whoops. Oh dear, this again. Right, let's go over to our product controller test and just copy that import. I don't know why IntelliJ just doesn't like me today. Right, okay, so we got that, and then we're also going to put this method signature of exception. There we go, add expect, and then again we're using the status here. So the status is http status.forbidden is the one that it throws. And then import the status one again, and value it should say. There we go. And this should be returning void. Oh god, I'm really doing this good today, aren't I? Okay, so there we go. So let's run this test that we've got here. And we should see spring initialize, yep, and then should see a lovely green tick. There we go. Okay, so what's next? So what else can we test on the request filter? So when we take it, let's have a look at it. So when we come in, we test to see if the token is null or starts with bearer, and that's basically just testing if it's valid. So what happens if we get a when we decode and we get a bad token. So let's give that a go, shall we? So test bad token. I'm just going to throw the exception up here because we know that we're going to use that. So MVC perform get authenticated path, and now we need to think, how do we add our authentication header? So that's quite simple. So next to the get, we just do dot header, and we give the name of the key of the header, so authorization, and then we put in what we want the token to be. So bad token that is not valid. There you go. And then we just do and expect status is HTTP status dot forbidden value. Okay, there we go. And we'll also do this a second time with the bearer in front of it, and then a third time where we just provide it with null. Sorry, we don't need to do null. Sorry, we don't need to do null because that's what that's effectively testing. Okay, I should say throws. Sorry, there we go. Okay, so that's another one. And then what else can we test for this request filter? Well, once we get in, we then test for the username from the JWT. Well, I mean, the JWT should never provide a username. It doesn't exist, so we're not going to worry about it too much. So, you know, what else is missing here then? Well, what about a user whose email is unverified? You know, so let's take a scenario for whatever reason. Someone registered a user, they've not verified their email, but they somehow were able to get JWT through a bug or something. Well, what are we preventing them from being able to use that JWT? Well, we're not. So let's test that. Well, let's test if it even is. So public void test unverified user throws exception. And we go MVC.perform get on the authenticated path dot header, and then we need our authorization token. Now, how do we get that? So before what we did is we injected two dependencies into our class here, the JWT and the local user service. So what we can do is we can get our local user. So we know that user B is unverified. So we go local user do dot find by username user B dot get, because it's going to return an optional. So that's how we do that. And then we go string token equals JWT service dot generate JWT user, and then we just drop that token in there. So let's run that test, see what happens. So there we go, spring initializing. And we got a green tick because we didn't check anything. Oh dear. So and expect status is HTTP status dot forbidden dot value. Helps if we put the right one in, doesn't it? So let's run that again. So there we go. Now it's building up, spring initializing, and oh no, look at that! It actually gave us a 500 code. It's even more strange. What's the 500 code for, I wonder? Right, okay, so let's see. What does 500 mean? Internal server error. Well, that's interesting, isn't it? It's not quite what I expected to see come out of it, I must be honest. Looks like we're going to have another one of the... something... Could not write JSON... Failed to later load collection. Oh, verification tokens. Right. Well, that's probably because it's trying to load the verification tokens outside of a Hibernate session. So let's go to our local user model. And see, look, JSON ignore for our addresses, but our verification token doesn't have that. So let's add JSON ignore here, and we'll rerun our test. So here we go, spring initializing. And the failed one was because look, status 200. It actually allowed it through. So here we go. Because we've put in JUnit testing, we've been able to identify an existing flaw in the code. So we can now go in here and fix it. So we got our user, and we can just say here, if user.isEmailVerified, that's when we want to execute this code. Oops. Otherwise we don't. So let's run that test one more time. And green tick. So there we go. So that's a nice little quick win that we call it. So let's do our final test, because we now actually, when we tested bad tokens, which is unverified users, well, let's test if it actually works for people it should do. So test successful. Right, and it throws an exception. And what we're going to do is same as kind of up here. And we're going to change it to be OK. And we're going to get user A instead, because we know user A is verified. So now let's just test this whole file and make sure that all our tests that we've just written are correct. There we go, loading up, and there we go, full array of green ticks. That's what we like to see. So there we go, we've now tested our security filter. So the next thing is preparation for our mocked version of the user authenticated areas, right? So the way that you can see here, the way that we traditionally work is that we send a header with the authorization and a bearer and a token. Well, I mean, that's going to be very tedious for every single unit test we want to do based on a user. We have to like submit a token through. Well, Spring helps us with that. It gives us an option. So what it allows us to do is to put something up here called with user details, right? And then you can specify like a username, so user A. And what that will do is it will inject, it will use a user details service class that you have to implement, and it will fetch that user and it will inject that user into the authentication, into the security principal for you, right? So what we need to do to facilitate that is to create a user details service. So what I'm going to do in here is I'm going to create a new Java class under security, and I'm going to call that my JUnit user details service, right? And inside this, what we have to do is we have to implement the user details service. There's a method to implement in that, so let's implement that. And this is where it does it. So when you do that with user details, it passes that string into here, and then the user details is what gets assigned to the authentication principal. So what we want to do is at AutoWire our local user DAO, and then what we're going to do is we're going to do local user.dao .find by username ignore case username, and then that's an optional of local user, so op user. There we go. So let's just import that and import that, and then we go if op user dot is present, then we're going to return op user dot get. Now, you see here we've got an error. That's because we've provided local user and it's asking for a user details, because that's what this method returns normally. Now, user details, if we look at it, it's basically an interface that allows Spring to kind of figure out some basic stuff about the user. We're not really using this in our current setup. But you can see here, it's a lot of stuff that we've got already. You know, get password, get username. We've got some bits and pieces here that we don't particularly need, and we've got get authorities. So an easy way around this is just implementing this interface into our local user. So if we come into local user and we just go implement user details, and then it's going to ask us to implement methods. So let's implement those methods. And we've got collection of get authorities. Well, we're not using authorities at the moment, so let's just put list of, and that will return an empty list. Password we've already got. If we scroll down, we've got is count non-expired, or true because all counts are non-expired. Is count non-locked, true because all counts are not locked. Is credentials non-expired, true because all credentials are not expired. And is enabled, true because all accounts are enabled. So there we go. We quickly implemented that interface just into our local user without an issue. So now when we come back to our detail service, you can see that error's gone away. So that's nice and easy. So let's now go in here and we're going to do a new package for order. And we're going to do a new Java class order controller test. And we're going to do our usual spring boot test and at auto configure mock MVC. And we will auto wire our mock MVC private mock MVC. And then we can start to test stuff. So just import that. All right. So what's the first things that we can test? Well, if we look at our order controller, we can see here the only thing that we really have in here is a get method for the order endpoint, and we say get all the orders for said user. Well, let's just test. If we're unauthenticated, does it reject it? That's a good point. So let's do that. So test unauthenticated order list. That throws an exception. Obviously, we missed the void. So then we're going to do mvc.perform a get on /order dot and expect status dot is http status dot forbidden dot value. Now we can just import these bits. Oh god, it's doing it again. Okay, let's go back to one of these other tests. We can copy and paste it in. There we go. Right, so that's going to test unauthenticated. Well, also, on the other hand, we want to make sure that all the orders that are presented to the user are belonging to that user. So let's do that. So we do @test public void test user a authenticated order list. That throws exception. And then what we're doing is we're going to say mvc.perform get the order and then expect that status dot is http status dot ok dot value and also expect, and this is where you can write your own kind of logic. So if you just do use the lambda expression, you can do result, and we can write our own kind of code for validation. So we can go the string JSON result.get response. Response.get content, I believe. Content as a string, yeah. So when the response comes back, remember we're sending JSON objects. We're not sending a Java object. So we've got to take this JSON object and we've got to convert it back into a Java object, right? So we can use the same library that we use to convert it to JSON for converting it back. So what we have is a list of web orders that get sent back to us, and that's going to be called orders. And we go, that's equal to new object mapper. Because we're inside a JUnit system, we don't need to worry about creating loads of objects because they get picked up pretty quickly. We can do read value JSON, and then we go, it's a new type reference of a list of web order. And we're not going to implement any of these. We're just going to kind of leave that like that. Yeah, we just need to put the curly brackets there. So there you can see, so read a value from the JSON. It's a new type reference of a list of web orders, and we've just got to do that curly bracket there. I'm not 100% sure the details of this, because normally you just do read value the JSON and then you put the class that you want, right? But the difficult part of it is that because we're doing a list, it's a bit more complicated because you can't do list, bracket web order dot class. So Jackson has put this type reference in here to be able to allow you to do that. So now we have our orders. What we want to do is we want to just go through all these web orders. So web order in orders, and we want to do assertions dot assert equals, and then we've got here, we need to assert that whatever user we are, the order belongs to that user, right? So we're user A, for example, and we do order.getUser.getUsername, and then we're going to return order list should only be orders belonging to the user. Right? And let's run this code now. Okay. So this is user A, right? So it should just work. So Spring's loaded up, and oh, it's failed. Well, why has it failed? Oh, well, we got the 403. Well, that's the forbidden one, isn't it? Let's check this. Yeah, forbidden. Well, why is that? It's because we've forgotten to add our definition of what user we are. So we need to put up here with user details user A. Now let's run that again, shall we? So now it's loading. As you can see here, it's failed. Oh, why is that? Well, unable to create security context using Spring test. Ah, right. I think I know what I've done here. Yeah, here we go. I forgot to make this a service. So at service above our JUnit user details service. That's my bad. I completely forgot about that part. And also, while you're here, you also want to write at primary above it, just so that it takes priority over anything else that gets injected. So let's give that one more go. I apologise for that. That was not an intentional. Oh no. So we failed again. What is it this time? Unrecognized field enabled. This is because we've added all those new fields to our thing. What we have to do, because Jackson, it can pick up methods, but it also pick up variables. It also picks up methods as well. So you actually need to come in here, and I don't know why these are override. We don't need them to override. JSON ignore. We need to JSON ignore all of these methods here that have been added by that user details. So just JSON ignore those. And one more time, my fingers are crossed because it should work this time. And here we go. There we go. It's passed. Brilliant. Okay. Well, but that's the thing is we added our user. If you remember from the start of the episode, I said about data.sql. I added a third user, and that third user has some orders themselves. Well, we tested the first user, but we haven't tested the second user. So how can we do that? So we could just come in here and go, oh, we'll run this again, but this user details is per method. It's not for the instance of the MVC. So what we need to do is we have to have a second method. Now we could just do another method and just change this to user B and user B, but that's not very nice code, is it? Really. What we can do is we can create a private method which just says test authenticated list belongs to user. Take in the username of the user, and then take this code out of here, drop it in here. Username becomes this, and because all of this stuff is the exact same, it's just the username changes. all we've got to do in here is now just go test that with user B in here instead. And we can do the exact same up here as well. And just change that to user A. And this will need to throw an exception. And if we now run the entire class again, Spring's initialized, and it should start to run. And there we go, all of our unit tests have passed. So that's brilliant. So that's it. We've done some unit tests based on not only the verification of the user's authentication, but also that user's data belongs to the user. So that's a nice little way of doing it. So there we go. So it's a nice little way of doing some checks. So I think that's going to be where I cut it off for this episode. Now, the keen-eyed among you may have noticed that we still have the login for the authentication controller to do. I think what I'm going to do, though, is leave that for now, and we'll do it as another episode in the future if we do any more tidying up of JUnits in the future, because we've got quite a lot done here already in terms of our JUnits. So I will see you in the next episode. As always, there's a playlist on my channel with all of the videos for the series in one, so you can watch them in one order. Thank you very much for watching. Feel free to like and subscribe, and always comment feedback, because it's not only just helpful for me but helpful for everyone. And I will see you in the next episode. Thank you very much.